What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew. And today, guys, welcome back to another horror stew, conspiracy theories, just weird shit video with Ike. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to call this video because this is a little bit different than what I normally do. It's not your typical horror stew or even your typical like conspiracy theories video. However, today's video does approach some subject matter that may be triggering to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Today we're going to be talking about rabbit holes. Internet rabbit holes where you start down something and you start reading more and more into it, and eventually you get to a point where you're like, what's real, what's fake, what is happening? And I came across this on the Icebergs subreddit. The Icebergs subreddit basically talks about various icebergs. What that means is that it can start with something that's well known and then devolve into things that are not so well known. A very good YouTuber named Wendigoon has done quite a few of these icebergs, everything from the it was like a disturbing movies iceberg to the SCP iceberg and serial killer iceberg and everything else. And they're really interesting. So if you've never heard of them, check out the Reddit or just Google it. There's a lot of stuff online as well. You can check out YouTube. There's plenty of stuff there. I recently happened across a disturbing Rabbit Holes Iceberg, and I happened upon a name that I didn't quite recognize. It felt like I knew the name, but I wasn't 100% sure. So I decided to look at it, give it a look, and see what was going on. And I happened upon the name Fred West. So just some information about Fred West. And obviously take into consideration that Fred West, for all intents and purposes, seemed like a pretty normal guy. I did some pretty deep dives into him. I have quite a bit of notes in regards to Fred West to kind of talk about here today. But keep in mind that I don't know everything about Fred West, so I definitely could have missed something as we talk about him. There are definitely things that you could even go into. I know this is supposed to be about a rabbit hole, and I'm going to kind of talk about why it's considered a rabbit hole because of how weird things are. But this is just some brief information about who he was, where he was born, stuff like that. But he was born to a family of farmers in 1941 in Herefordshire, and then he moved to Gloucester in 1962. These are all places overseas in England, Europe, so pardon me if I mess any of these up. And a couple notable events. He was actually initially married to he was married to his wife, Rose, who we'll talk about here in a little bit, in 1972. Rose was 18 when they got married, and they'd been having an affair since she was 15. So this was Fred's second marriage. Fred was also married to a Catherine Costello, also known as Raina, and who was 18 and pregnant with actually somebody else's child when they had been married. She actually gave birth to her daughter, Charmaine, in 1963, and then gave birth to Anne Marie in 1964, which was Fred West's actual daughter. Then in 1967, we have a nanny named Anne McFall who would work for the family. And then let's see, other notable event that happened is Costello actually left West in 1969 amidst abuse and sexual assault allegations towards West. So these are some events to take into consideration leading up to the next part, which is Fred West was a mass serial killer. Not just Fred West. Fred West and his wife Rose West were both murderers, serial killers. So a couple things to take into consideration as we move forward is that Fred West is not a good person at all. From everything that I've read about him, he's just a very sick and sadistic person, and a lot of the stuff he did was very vile and awful. That being said, I want to again reiterate that what I'm going to talk about next is what he did to these people, not in detail obviously, but I'm going to talk about the victims, talk about what he did and why this is considered a rabbit hole. So you're going to have to kind of buckle up and bear with me here because there's a lot to cover, but let's get into it. Fred West and his victims. So we're going to start out in the beginning. It's thought that Anne McFall, who was the nanny to the family who lived with West in his caravan, was his first victim. Anne McFall obviously Obviously, I don't have a whole lot of information on her specifically, but she did live with them. Sort of a weird circumstance, I guess you could say, with Fred West and his caravan and his whole deal. But we believe that she was his first victim. Costello, which was actually Fred's first wife, was another victim who actually lost contact with her family in 1971, so they thought she was missing. But she was actually found / West admitted to killing her in 1994. But there are also other victims to be worried about here. Fred West and his wife Rose murdered and tortured an unknown number of women. Now, that's what I wanted to kind of get to before we got too far into it, is that we actually don't know the exact number of people that they assaulted and murdered. And that is sort of, it's horrifying because we don't truthfully know the full extent of what they did. What we do know is this. There is an unknown number of women murdered over a 20-year period from 1967 to 1987. That is a 20-year period of time where an unknown number of women were murdered and just horribly tortured. Now, there are 12 known victims. Now, Fred West was officially charged with 12 murders, but him and Rose were only charged for 10. Rose was only indicted on the 10 specifically, but Fred had 2 additional murders that she was either not a part of or not party of to some juncture. That being said, a couple other things to take into consideration here was Anne McFall, which was one of the victims, was 18. She was actually pregnant with West's child. She disappeared in 1967, as we kind of mentioned. And her remains were found in a field near West's home village with her unborn baby in 1994. Costello's body was also found nearby. Rose West actually murdered Costello's 8-year-old daughter while West was in prison for theft in 1971. Now, I want to take a small pause there to mention that West had a lot of priors to the murders. And when I say priors, he was actually convicted of a lot of different crimes, including child molestation, prior to being put in jail for murder. Which seems very odd to me that he had all these different crimes, most of which were horrible felonies, and he was still not in jail. That being said, remains of Linda Gow, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Siganator, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Motz, Shirley Ann Robinson, and Allison Chambers were also found near the West's home, or in the home, also referred to as a house of horrors because of the fact that they were literally pulling up floorboards and the walls and finding literal corpses everywhere. Not only that, the couple's daughter Heather had also been found around the same time, which actually leads into how they were caught. But I do want to note that, again, these are just the bodies that they found, and there were other potential victims that we'll talk about in a little bit that were never found or never, I guess, to be heard of again. That being said, it's very important to note that out of all these victims, they also killed their own children. Heather was actually both Rose and Fred's daughter, and then of course they had killed Costello's daughter because she was pregnant. Anne McFall was pregnant. Costello had a daughter, which was, she was pregnant, I should say. Daughter was Charmaine, 1963, and then Anne Marie in 1964. I believe the 2 of them are still alive, but if I remember correctly, they were also assaulted by Fred West.
Hey, how's it going, guys? So it's Ike here. Small note, I did actually make a little mess up in that previous statement right before this note. So unfortunately, Charmaine did pass away. She was buried with her mother. And then Anne Marie West is still alive. Unfortunately, Anne Marie, she had some issues regarding, a slew of things. But also a small other note was that Fred West's brother actually was ready to get tried for assaulting Anne Marie and actually hung himself waiting for trial. So there's just another step in that rabbit hole that you'll learn about soon.
So that being said, There are other people who were victimized by them, but these were specifically people that have been murdered and whose bodies have been found. But next we need to talk about how they were caught. And this is actually very interesting, that they were caught in the way that they were. And this is obviously almost a little over a decade after they had ended their killing spree in the 80s. They were actually caught. But it's very interesting that a mere fairy tale led to them being caught. So you're probably saying to yourself, what do you mean by a fairy tale? So kids in the area were making jokes / like weird stories that were like supposedly like rumors about the West's house, that their missing daughter Heather was under the patio. Now, who knows why, who knows how, but there was a detective that thought maybe this wasn't just a story or some dark humor, that there was some truth to what these children were saying. And so with that, in force, they got some people to go over, talk to Fred West, and West then admitted to murdering his daughter in 1994. This, of course, led to the discovery of other victims and other remains, to which they then, of course, they admitted to quite a few. And then sort of what happens next is that they go to trial, of course. So this is kind of what happens to Fred and Rose. So Fred West was actually charged with 12 murders, as we mentioned, but actually hung himself in a cell, age 53, in 1995 before actually facing trial. Rose did face trial alone and became one of the most notorious female serial killers in Britain at the time. Trial judge actually told Rose that he hoped she would never be released. And then, as well, she is currently serving life in prison. There have been talks of her trying to appeal her thing. She actually maintains her innocence to this day, indicating that she actually didn't do anything, basically that she did nothing wrong. Like she wasn't actually involved in any of it, even though there are people who put her at the time and place that some of these people died and everything else. But definitely it's such a strange concept that, there's all this surrounding evidence that is kind of in front of her. And even if some of it is circumstantial or maybe not even full-fledged evidence, it's enough to make enough speculation and for people to draw conclusions that she was most definitely involved. But here's where the rabbit hole starts, because the rabbit hole, obviously this whole situation is just very obscure, very odd, and very honestly horrifying to think about. But there is sort of an additional step that we can take to kind of start going down this rabbit hole. And there are other things that I'm not even going to mention in this that could be mentioned as part of this rabbit hole. But for now, let's get into sort of why this would be considered a disturbing rabbit hole. So here's where the rabbit hole begins. First and foremost, the police were almost certain that there were other victims. All right, even prior to the next step of this rabbit hole is that the police were pretty certain that they didn't just end with who they found. All right, which was a freaking that is a fucking astronomical understatement, because Fred admitted to murdering up to 30 people. Now, a key word, operating word here, up to 30 people may not have been the only number of people that he murdered, meaning there's possibly 18 other victims, 18 plus other victims that we don't know about. And since he killed himself in prison, there's really never going to be a way that we do know about it, unless there's some other entity, maybe Rose admits to some of it, or whatever the case may be. Unless someone else comes forward with evidence, or Rose comes forward with evidence, or even people who have other evidence, there's not going to ever be really another step to kind of figure out what happened to these other victims. So it's very strange that this actually happened. There's a lot of murders that are speculated to be attributed to Fred West, but obviously there's no concrete evidence. When stuff like this comes up and somebody dies after they admit to murdering other people, people are going to start pulling up cold cases and missing persons, and they're going to be like, how many people did this guy kill? He was active from this time to this time. How many other people could he have murdered, truthfully? And even beyond that, this is obviously, there's plenty of stuff that could go into this, but another thing is, again, that Rose maintains her innocence. She indicates that she had nothing to do with any of this, and that it's absolutely absurd that she'd be serving time in jail when she had nothing to do with any of it. In addition to that, Fred So there was another person, I do forget their name, who actually reported Fred to the authorities numerous times. And when I say numerous times, I mean upwards of like 5 or 6 times. I mean, even more than that. But they never did anything because Fred West was originally a confidential informant for the police.
Hey, what's going on, guys? One other note here. This may happen again, who knows? But the individual's name was Terrence Crick. Terrence Crick had reported West to the authorities on numerous occasions, and of course, it never came of anything. Unfortunately, Crick was very stricken by grief in regards to this, especially when he found out what had happened. And he actually did commit suicide in regards to that. Horrible situation, of course, but unfortunately, the story of the confidential informant seemed to kind of explain why nothing was ever done initially. But that being said, the name of that individual was Terrence Crick, and I think he's a very vital part of the story because, you know, he did try to tell somebody and unfortunately was ignored.
And some of the stuff that this guy was friends with or acquaintances with Fred, and Fred would show him things such as pictures of these people being mutilated or tortured or murdered or everything else. They were literal Polaroids of that. Not only that, he would show this man utensils and instruments that he was using to perform illegal abortions on the people that he was murdering and subjugating, as well as other people. Okay, can you imagine that this guy reports this guy to the police so many times? The police are like, well, I don't know about any of that, but he's a confidential informant, so whatever. The guy kills himself, right? He died because of carbon monoxide poisoning. He was found in his car, the whole tube deal, I'm assuming. But he actually murdered himself because they assumed that he just could not handle the fact that this guy had, he's trying to report this guy and nothing's ever coming of it. But I guess that also kind of aided in the fact that there's all of these stories about the West household, that their daughter's under the patio, and then in addition to all the people that are trying to, implicate him and everything else, that eventually they started believing it, and they're like, okay, well, maybe even though he is a confidential informant, maybe we should do something about this. And then they did, and then they entered the House of Horrors, which, rightfully so, literally littered with bodies. Literally littered with bodies. That being said, there's one other small tidbit, because like I said, there are plenty of other, ways that we could go down this rabbit hole. There's also theories that like they were going around and that they didn't murder all these people at the same time. There's a lot of people who think that they were like, because there was like actually a break in murders during the 20-year time span, where they thought that they were actually like grooming and trying to prostitute out some of these women that they had like captured and were abusing, and that's part of the reason why he was learning how to, do these literal back alley abortions to do so. And it's honestly, it is incredibly disturbing and repulsive that all of this went on for as long as it did. But it doesn't stop there. In May of 2021, there was actually a documentary team who found possible evidence of another murder in a cafe. Right? There were possible remains found under the cafe as well, that I was actually frequented by West, and which prompted them to do a dig. Now, there was other evidence provided by the documentary crew. I can't remember what exactly it was. It may have been like cloth or clothing or something like that. But the point being is that it was enough to prompt the police to start investigating, and they actually dug up the cafe, which they didn't find anything, at least not yet, or I don't know if there was any conclusive evidence from that. But it was just strange that even now, decades later, we're still finding out stuff about this case. And there is a documentary, I believe. I don't know if it's out actually yet, but I believe it's supposed to be on Netflix about Fred West, which is kind of ironic that all of this is happening kind of right now as I had found this on this disturbing iceberg. So that being said, I'm going to kind of cap it off there because there's a lot more you could go down with in this rabbit hole. Honestly, the Wikipedia is really detailed about this guy. Like, I mean, we're talking stupid detailed. So check that out if you want to. But really, there's a lot of shit that you could really just start digging at if you were to look at this murder and everything else. But that being said, let's move into final thoughts and let's close off the video. So, quick final thoughts. The whole story of Fred West is a very disturbing and cautionary tale about when you should believe people and not. I guess it really, I mean, it's weird that this whole thing went on and Fred West was a confidential informant, and literally they didn't actually catch on to what was happening until years later, when there was literal fairy tales and folk tales and urban legends being said about how their missing daughter was under their floorboards. And it's like it just is wild to me that it went this long and had this huge period of time where they basically almost got away scot-free, and the only thing that prompted the police to do anything was the fact that they were hearing these stories for children, and rather than just being like, oh, it's just an urban legend, some dudes is like, look, they may be onto something, let's go look at it. And not to mention the fact that Fred West was a habitual offender in many other ways, and there had been people trying to get the police to do something about him in some way, shape, or form, so much so that one person killed themselves over the guilt of him continuing to do shit. It's really weird to me that it went on for as long as it did, even though there was, I would say, pretty mounting evidence against Fred West even prior to these weird urban legends, that for whatever reason the police were like, shit, that seems pretty legit, guys. Let's go dig up this guy's house. But it is some, I guess you can say, some recompense that the house was demolished. There's now a park and I believe a garden of some kind dedicated to the victims, I believe. I could be wrong. I thought I read that, but obviously I'm not an expert. I don't live in that area, of course. But it is definitely a strange story with a lot of deep rabbit holes that go in 100 million directions, and it definitely caught my curiosity a little bit. So if you want to learn more about Fred West, there is a documentary of some kind coming out at some juncture. Feel free to look up on Wikipedia. Maybe one day Wendigoon can do a video about this. Maybe he can do a little more in depth of a dive. I obviously just did my research from some pretty surface level sources, and there's obviously more stuff that you can get into. Like I mentioned, like the rabbit hole doesn't end here. There's like a bunch of other stuff that people are talking about and theorizing about when it comes to Fred West. So feel free to look at that in your own free time for sure. I recommend it, especially if you're into like true crime and whatnot. But that being said, we're going to close it off there, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I plan to do more like this because the iceberg that I found had some other interesting items and articles that I'd like to look into as well. So hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, give us a like and a subscribe. Follow us on social media. Twitter and Facebook is linked below and at the end of the video. And as always, if you want to join the Geek-Stew crew, let us know. Hit us up on social media. Leave a comment down below. We'll get in touch with you somehow. But that being said, I hope everybody out there is staying safe, staying happy, staying healthy, and we will see you in the next one. See ya.